what are the origins of basso continuo, and how did it become such a big deal in the Baroque period? And how did it change from the beginning of the Baroque period to the end of the Baroque period and even beyond the more than 200 years that it was a staple in Western classical music? If you're curious, let's find out together. So before we start, I just want to say this video is not going to cover what basso continuo is. If you want to find out what is basso continuo, I have another video. You can check it out. Here's what it looks like. You can search for it. It's called What is Basso Continuo? That'll tell you all about what basso continuo is. What is going to be covered in this video, what this video is all about, is the origins of basso continuo and then how basso continuo developed throughout the Baroque period and then beyond. So what are the origins of basso continuo? It started in the 1570s when organ was first added to a cappella music. At that point, organ was just playing all the parts, so it was just kind of copying what was happening in a cappella music that now wasn't a cappella anymore because it had accompaniment. And so all of those parts were being played by the organ and being sung. That morphed pretty quickly into the organ playing just from a bass line instead of reading open scores or reading all the parts. Not necessarily an open score, depends on the printing and the manuscripts of the period. But instead of playing all the parts, reading from the bass line and playing the harmonic material, but not necessarily copying exactly what all the voices were doing. Now this is all happening before the invention of figures. So we're talking the last few decades of the Renaissance period, the last few decades of the 16th century, the 1500s. That's what's happening in the origins, the very beginnings of basso continuo playing before we get to figures. But then a really crazy thing happens in music history. We get this group of men, we call them now the Florentine Camerata, and they were a bunch of philosophers and aristocrats and thinkers, people that were really interested in advancing science, advancing art, advancing music. The Florentine Camerata, they were a group of men in Florence who got together in the last decades of the Renaissance period, so the last decades of the 1500s, the 16th century. And they said, okay, part of what they wanted to do was recreate music from antiquity, from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Now, the idea of ancient Rome and ancient Greece being really cool was not new. That's what the whole Renaissance was about. Renaissance means rebirth, literally. That's what it translates to. And that was a rebirth of classical antiquity, of ancient Rome and ancient Greek culture, including sculpture, including other forms of art and writing and discourse. But they didn't know much about what music in antiquity sounded like because it didn't stick around. Music is a fleeting art. So if it wasn't written down, which there's very, very little of it that is from that time period, very, very little. And even that stuff they didn't know how to read. So that stuff didn't stick around. So they had to try and think, okay, what did music from that long ago sound like? And then they came up with something that they thought was a recreation of ancient music from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And what they actually turned out to do is they invented opera. They invented this thing called monody, mono meaning one, and that meant a single vocal line with accompaniment. And that was early opera. Those two things are essentially the same. The terms aren't interchangeable because they mean different things, but early opera was monody. And so they invented monody, they invented early opera. They invented this new kind of music, even though they were actually trying to recreate old music. That is what happened and started the Baroque period. That's the beginning of what we define as the Baroque period, right around the year 1600. As we just saw, basso continuo was happening a little bit before this, 1570s and so, doing its own thing with church music especially and accompanying a cappella music. But then this seems perfect. Monody, a single vocal line with accompaniment. Basso continuo could be that accompaniment, and basso continuo gets tied and interweaved with this invention of opera, and then we're off to the races as it is that these two things blossom and bloom together. Basso continuo really starts blooming and blossoming as it gets attached to opera around 1600, And that's when we start using the term basso continuo. I'll get to that in just a second. And that's when we start seeing figures, numbers under or over chords in music. That's when it starts with basso continuo. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about basso continuo or about the harpsichord or even about early music topics in general, please subscribe to my channel where I put out content about all of those things. Okay, so figures start appearing first in music, basso continuo figures, the very last few years of the 1500s. So like 1597, 1598, when the first operas are being written. The first opera is by Jacopo Peri, who, if I remember correctly, was part of the Florentine Camerata, or at least was heavily associated with them. We're not sure if there's an official connection. We know a lot of the people that are in it. I believe Jacopo Peri is one of the people we think was part of it, but we don't have verification. But there were other cool people part of the Florentine Camerata, like Vincenzo Galilei, who is the father of Galileo Galilei, the famous astronomer, mathematician that was excommunicated from the Catholic Church for saying that the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. Anyway, I digress. It's just really cool. But those are the people that were thinking up this new old music that is opera. So basso continuo figures appear in the first operas, but then the first time the term basso continuo, those words, are ever seen in print are in a collection of sacred music by Lodovico Viadana that's published in 1602. That collection is Cento Concerti Ecclesiastici, 100 ecclesiastical concertos, even though there actually aren't 100 pieces in there. His ambitions were greater than his publications actually showed. But Lodovico Viadana, 1602, publishes a collection of sacred vocal music, concertos being, in this case, concerted music, meaning voices with instruments, not concerto as we think of it later. This collection has figures in it, but actually fewer than the operas that come earlier from Peri and other composers. It actually just has sharps and flats in the score in a few places, but he is the first person, Viadana, to use the words basso continuo in a publication. It's the first time they appear in print. As we know, though, from what I've just said, figures and the practice of basso continuo predate Viadana. So he's the first to use the term in print. He uses basso continuo in his pieces, which, by the way, these ecclesiastical concertos, he wrote them because he felt like singers were taking motets and all this other a cappella music or stuff that had the earlier form of basso continuo with it and singing just parts of it instead of all of the lines of music, and he thought that was a really terrible practice because you miss some of the harmonic material if you're not singing all the parts in this music from the Renaissance, and you're missing some of the text if you're not singing all the parts of the music from the Renaissance. And so he thought a great solution would be to use this new idea that it was already happening with monody in the secular world and opera and put it with church singers, so that 1 or 2 or 3 singers could sing on Sunday. You wouldn't be missing anybody if they got sick or for any other reason. And then you could just have the organ fill out the harmonies, and then you have music that isn't missing any of its parts. So what about these early figures, though? Like I said, in the Viadana collection of 1602, they're very minimal. There's just sharps and flats in the score. There aren't even actually any numbers in that publication at all. But there are publications earlier, like the first operas, a few years before that do have what we now think more classically of as actual figures. Numbers under or usually over the bass line in a piece of music that tell us what the harmonies are. There aren't too many of these, though. A lot of them are missing, so this is an era very much of partially figured music, even when the music has figures. So often there are chords that you would have been expected to play that don't show up in the figures. Often those are our 6 chords in various places, or 6 being 6, a second inversion if we think of it in Roman numerals, or a 6th over the bass with a 3rd if we think of it in figured bass terminology. Those are often missing in these early scores. So are common cadential figures, so are sharps needed or natural signs, as the case may be, for major chords, for dominant, the 5th of the key that you're in, the 5th over tonic. And major cadences were expected in this time period, and they often aren't written in the figures. So these pieces are very much partially figured. They don't include all the figures. Early figured pieces were generally this way. They didn't include absolutely everything that you were supposed to play. Basso continuo was invented in Italy, as we saw. Makes sense. Florentine Camerata is Florence, Italy. So that's where opera was invented. Basso continuo was also invented, predates that a little bit, but invented in Italy. Viadana, Italian, is an Italian practice that spreads at different rates to the other parts of Europe. So quick adopters out of Italy of basso continuo were Germany and Spain. They quickly took on the practice of basso continuo and made it their own, made it part of their own music. Slow adapters, though, were France and England. France did not start using basso continuo for a whole 50 years or so after it was invented, till about the 1650s, when they started writing operas in France. That's when they started using them, so they were late to operas, and they were late to using continuo. England also doesn't start using basso continuo in their music until 1650s or 1660s. Now, basso continuo, as we see, it gets running as soon as it gets attached with opera and monody, these new genres that are just blossoming. But what else is blossoming during this time? Instrumental music. We have what's called the rise of instrumental music. It starts at the end of the Renaissance period, but it's going crazy by the early Baroque period. Early Baroque period, I'm talking about specifically, in this case, the first 50 or so years of the Baroque period, 1600 to 1650 or so. The violin, for example, an instrument that was originally used for dance music and not as a serious classical instrument, starts to take on a life of its own, starts to become a solo instrument, starts to have instrumental monodies written for it, where you have solo violin sonatas in the first few decades of the 1600s. They use basso continuo as the accompaniment, as is the practice that's so popular that's happening with vocal music. These get going more and more. We get more and more instrumental music, a variety of instruments that are now seen as solo instruments in their own right start to be written for virtuosically. These pieces have basso continuo with them. So basso continuo is now getting attached to everything in the Baroque. Everything that is Baroque music has basso continuo in it, unless it's a piece specifically for a solo instrument without accompaniment, which is a small subset of what's happening in the Baroque period. As we move later and later into the Baroque period, we get more and more complex figures. We get a more and more complex harmonic language as we move that way, and figures go with it. We start to see pieces, especially by the late Baroque, but even a little bit before that, that are more fully figured, so there are fewer pieces where you have chords that are left to the player's knowledge about harmony and about basso continuo playing. You get more pieces that have more figures in them, more completely figured. And as we get toward the end of the first century of the Baroque period, so right around 1700, we start to move into what's called the common practice period, with the music of Arcangelo Corelli, right around 1700 and a little bit before. So what is common practice period music? What is the common practice period? That is where the harmony that we're familiar with today, so the harmony that dominates music from about 1700 until the end of the Romantic period before we move into the 20th century and new tonalities or atonality, depending on what type of music and what composer you're talking about. That's the common practice period, where harmony works the way we learned it in music school and music theory, if you've taken music theory. That's common practice harmony. Before that, the first 100 years of the Baroque period, we are not using that system. We're coming out of modal systems that existed long before common practice harmony. And those are transitioning to common practice harmony. Once again, the first composer to be considered to really fully compose in common practice music is Arcangelo Corelli. But the music before that is not fully tonal. It's modal with shifting to tonality. And so figures are part of that system too. Basso continuo is invented 100 years before we get to the common practice period. It's used in all that music as we shift to the common practice period and to common practice period tonality and harmonic patterns and structures. But we have figures that shift as our harmony shifts. We get more figures as we get more complex harmony. Now, by the late Baroque period, published music tends to be fully figured. Once again, fully figured is all the chords you're expected to play are written in the music. There aren't any left up to either guesswork or, in that period, knowledge that you would have accumulated having been a continuo player all your life, most of your life, having played a ton of this music. Now, I say published music specifically because I'm talking about things that were printed, things that were expected to be played by people other than the people who wrote them and their ensembles. Manuscripts, however, not as consistently fully figured because they were for a small circle of usage. They were designed for the people who wrote them and the people who were playing their music in a certain location, in a certain time. And there wasn't an expectation that other people in other places, and for that matter, other times, would need to know exactly what they were doing. Their practice was very familiar to them, so they didn't necessarily fully figure their music and the way that we see most late Baroque publications of music having being fully figured. Basso continuo is used for all of the Baroque period. All of Western classical music during the Baroque period, except for these very small subset of Baroque music, solo instrumental pieces that don't have any continuo with them or any accompaniment at all. Basso continuo is in absolutely everything else. It is a very key part of Baroque music and how it works and how it was played. Basso continuo doesn't stop being used in the Baroque period either, though. It bleeds into classical music, even as tastes shift with a rise of periodicity and a rise of thinner textures. Basso continuo keeps being used for a while into the classical period, and some composers use it longer than others. Composers like Haydn use it in his symphonies. Beethoven even uses it in his piano concertos all the way up until around 1800, and a little bit past that, even his fifth piano concerto, the Emperor Concerto, has basso continuo figures in it for the orchestral tutti sections when the solo piano part is not playing solo sections. Now, there are new genres, especially genres like the string quartet, which develop in the classical period that don't have any basso continuo. These are some of the first genres for almost 200 years that absolutely do not have continuo as part of them. So basso continuo sticks around throughout the classical period in one specific genre, though it doesn't die out, and that's in opera. We switch over from using the harpsichord to using the forte piano at some point during the classical period, undefined. Different places would have had that happen at different times. We move into a use of a new instrument, but we're still using the basso continuo practice, especially for recitatives in opera. Recitatives were part of opera throughout the Baroque period, often accompanied only by a keyboard instrument with a bowed bass instrument or other continuo instruments specifically. That's called simple recitative, or it used to be called secco, dry recitative. Those recitatives live on in opera, and so does the practice of accompanying them with basso continuo. So even into the early Romantic period, operas like Rossini's Barber of Seville, which was published or first premiered in 1816, that has recits that would have been accompanied by basso continuo, played on the forte piano with accompanying bowed string instruments. All the way up into the mid-1800s, so the 1850s, the 1860s, we still have recits in opera before we lose them in later parts of the Romantic period. These recits are being accompanied in basso continuo, with forte pianos, pianofortes, earlier versions of the modern piano. That is what is still being used in opera. Basso continuo is still existing until it finally fades out in the middle of the 1800s in opera, even though it's faded out in all other music quite a ways before that. Basso continuo was part of music for more than 200 years, an essential element that was in almost every single piece written during that time period. It had its decline, but not its death, in the classical period, even bleeding into the Romantic, as we saw in the genre of opera. Now, it did officially finally die out in the mid-1800s and wasn't used for anything until it was revived in the 20th century, especially with a historically informed approach to playing basso continuo, looking at the original sources, figuring out how people in the Baroque actually played basso continuo, starting in earnest this revival in the 1970s. It is the ancestor of jazz lead sheets and chord charts, although there is no direct line from basso continuo practice that leads fully into jazz practice. It is definitely the ancestor of those systems of notation, however. Okay, that's all for today. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and hit that little notification bell so you get notified every time I put out a new video. And if you found this video useful or helpful, please give it a like and leave me a comment below so that I can help you out with any questions you might have. Thanks so much for watching.